My wife has been disappearing once a month for 22 years, and I just discovered who she's been secretly visiting. I feel like my entire marriage has been built on a lie, and the worst part is, I don't know if I'm allowed to be angry about it. I'm a 52-year-old man, and I've been married to my wife, Linda, for 24 years. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party when we were both in our late 20s, and I knew from the moment I saw her that she was the one. She was quiet, a little guarded, but there was something about her that made me want to know everything. It took me 6 months to get her to agree to a date. She told me early on that she had a complicated past and that she wasn't ready to talk about it. I didn't push her. I figured when she was ready, she would tell me. She never did. Our marriage has been good. We raised 2 sons together, built a home, created a life. Linda has always been a devoted mother and wife. She never gave me any reason to doubt her loyalty. But there was always this one thing that I could never fully understand. Once a month, Linda would leave for the day. She told me it was to visit an old friend from college who was sick and lived a couple hours away. She said this friend didn't like visitors and preferred to keep her illness private, so Linda never invited me to come along. I accepted it because I trusted her. For 22 years, I never questioned it. Not once. Last month, Linda was in the shower when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the message preview caught my eye. It said, "Mom, can't wait to see you Saturday. Lily is so excited to show you her drawing." My heart stopped. Mom. I stood there staring at the screen trying to make sense of what I just read. Linda and I have 2 sons. We don't have a daughter. We don't have a grandchild named Lily. When Linda came downstairs, I asked her about it calmly. I watched her face go pale. She sat down at the kitchen table and started crying before she even said a word. Then she told me everything. Before Linda met me, when she was only 19 years old, she got pregnant by a boyfriend who left her the moment he found out. She was alone, scared, and her parents told her she had brought shame on the family. They pressured her into giving the baby up for adoption. She had a daughter, a little girl she held for 2 hours before they took her away. Linda said she never recovered from it. She said she thought about that baby every single day for years, wondering where she was, if she was happy, if she was loved. When our oldest son was born, Linda said holding him brought back all the grief she thought she had buried. A few years into our marriage, Linda hired someone to find her daughter. The girl was 6 years old at the time, living with a loving family in another state. Linda didn't want to disrupt her life, so she kept her distance. But when her daughter turned 18, she reached out. She wanted to know her birth mother. That was 22 years ago. For over 2 decades, Linda has been visiting her daughter once a month. She watched her graduate high school. She was there when she got married. She was in the waiting room when Lily, her granddaughter, was born. She has an entire relationship with a child I never knew existed. I sat there listening to my wife describe this whole other life she had been living parallel to ours. A life full of birthdays and holidays and milestones that I was never a part of. She told me she wanted to tell me so many times but was terrified I would leave her. She said she was ashamed of the secret and didn't know how to bring it up after so many years had passed. She said she loved me and never meant to hurt me. I believe her, but I also feel like I'm mourning a version of my wife that never existed. The woman I thought I knew completely had an entire chapter of her life hidden from me. She has a daughter. I have a stepdaughter I've never met. My sons have a half-sister they know nothing about. And for 22 years, every time she walked out that door to visit her sick friend, she was going to see the child she gave away. I haven't told her what I've decided yet. I don't even know what I've decided. But she's been asking me every day if we're going to be okay. And honestly, I don't know how to answer her. I moved my clothes into the guest room that first night and barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Linda walking out the door with her purse over her shoulder, telling me she'd be back by dinner. I counted backward through the years, trying to remember specific trips. The time she left on Tom's birthday weekend because her friend was having a bad day. The time she missed Jake's soccer championship because her friend needed her. All those moments I thought showed Linda's loyalty to an old friendship were actually her choosing her secret daughter over our family. I lay there in the dark, going through every monthly absence like flipping through a photo album, except now every picture had been ruined. On the second day, I went to work but couldn't focus. My coworkers asked if I was feeling okay and I told them I had a stomach bug. That felt easier than explaining my wife had been living a double life for 2 decades. I came home early and found Linda in the kitchen making dinner like nothing had changed. She looked at me with these hopeful eyes, like maybe I'd slept on it and decided everything was fine. I walked past her without saying anything and went back to the guest room. The third night, Linda knocked on the door around midnight. I pretended to be asleep, but I could hear her crying on the other side of the door. Part of me wanted to open it, to hold her and tell her we'd figure this out. The other part wanted to pack a bag and leave. I stayed in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. On the 4th morning, I found Linda sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She looked like she hadn't slept either. I poured myself coffee and sat down across from her. I needed to understand how she actually pulled this off for 22 years without me noticing. She started talking quietly, explaining that she hired a private investigator 6 years into our marriage. She found out Melissa was living in a suburb about 2 hours north with her adoptive parents. Linda said she drove up there once, parked across the street from their house, and watched a 6-year-old girl play in the front yard. She didn't approach them or introduce herself. She just sat there watching her daughter live a life that didn't include her. When Melissa turned 18, Linda sent her a letter through the adoption agency. She said she waited 3 months for a response, checking the mailbox every single day. When Melissa finally wrote back, she said she wanted to meet her birth mother. Linda told me about their first meeting at a coffee shop, how Melissa looked so much like her that other customers probably thought they were sisters. She described the careful planning that went into every visit, how she scheduled them around my work trips or weekends when I had golf tournaments. She said Melissa's adoptive parents knew about the visits and supported them, which somehow made me feel even worse. Linda pulled out her phone and opened a photo album I'd never seen before. She turned the screen toward me, and I saw a young woman who could have been Linda at 25. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same small smile. Linda scrolled through pictures, and I watched Melissa's life unfold in images. Birthday parties with candles and cake, graduation photos in a blue cap and gown, wedding pictures where Linda stood off to the side, not in the family grouping but close enough to be included. Then photos of a tiny baby in a hospital blanket, and Linda told me that was Lily, born 3 years ago. I stared at a picture of Linda holding her granddaughter, and the joy on her face was something I'd never seen before. Not when our sons were born, not on our wedding day. This was different, like she'd been carrying a weight for decades and finally got to put it down. I realized my wife had been living 2 completely separate lives, and the one with me had always been missing something. The one with Melissa filled that empty space, and I was just now finding out it existed. I called Morris that afternoon because I couldn't talk to Linda anymore without wanting to scream or cry or both. He showed up at 7 with a 6-pack of beer and sat with me in the garage. I told him everything while we drank, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me a question I'd been avoiding since Linda's confession. He wanted to know if I was trying to save my marriage or if I was looking for someone to tell me it was okay to leave. I didn't have an answer. Morris leaned back in his chair and said that Linda hadn't cheated on me, hadn't stolen money, hadn't done anything except love a child she'd been forced to give away when she was 19. He said the secret was wrong, but the love wasn't. I told him I didn't want to hear that right now, that I needed him to be on my side. He said he was on my side, which was why he was telling me the truth instead of what I wanted to hear. Morris kept talking, and his words made me angry in a way I couldn't explain. He pointed out that Linda had carried this alone for our entire marriage, that she'd been terrified of losing me if I knew the truth. He asked me what I would have done if she'd told me about Melissa on our 3rd date, or after our 1st anniversary, or when Tom was born. Would I have understood, or would I have seen her as damaged, as someone keeping secrets? I wanted to say I would have been supportive, but I honestly didn't know. Morris said that maybe my hurt wasn't the only thing that mattered here, that Linda had been hurting for 40 years over a baby she held for 2 hours. His words planted something in my mind that I didn't want there, the idea that I might not be the victim in this situation. Or at least not the only victim. I finished my beer and told Morris I needed to be alone. He left, and I sat in the garage until after midnight, thinking about everything he'd said and hating that he was probably right. Linda came to me 2 days later while I was reading in the living room. She stood in the doorway looking nervous, and then she asked if she should cancel her next visit to Melissa. It was scheduled for Saturday, 5 days away. I looked at her and realized she was asking for permission, like I had any right to tell her she couldn't see her own daughter. I told her to go because I needed space anyway, and she nodded and left the room. After she walked away, I felt sick. I'd just given permission for the lie to continue, for her to keep living this double life. Except it wasn't a lie anymore because I knew about it now. But it still felt like deception, like I was agreeing to be the husband who stayed home while his wife visited the family he wasn't part of. I spent the next 5 days dreading Saturday, knowing that when she left, I'd be sitting in our house imagining what she was doing with them. Saturday morning came and Linda left at 8. She kissed my cheek before she walked out, something she used to do every time she left for her monthly visit. Now I knew she'd been kissing me goodbye before going to see Melissa. I sat on the couch after she left and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I kept picturing Linda walking into Melissa's house, hugging her daughter, playing with Lily. I imagined Lily calling her grandma, the same way our son's future kids would someday. Except Lily got there first, and Linda had been her grandmother for 3 years without me knowing. The jealousy surprised me because I didn't expect to feel territorial about a title. But I did. I was jealous of Melissa for having Linda's attention one day every month. I was jealous of the relationship they'd built while I thought my wife was visiting a sick friend. I was even jealous of a 6-year-old girl who got to know her grandmother when my sons didn't even know they had a half-sister. The feelings made me ashamed, but I couldn't shake them. Linda came home around 7 that evening. She walked in with this careful expression, like she was waiting to see if I'd be angry or cold or silent. She set her purse on the counter and told me she'd told Melissa everything. She said Melissa knew now that I hadn't known about her, that Linda had kept her a secret for 22 years. I felt my stomach drop because this abstract situation had suddenly become real. It wasn't just Linda's secret daughter anymore. It was a real person who knew about me, who knew her mother had hidden her existence from her husband. Linda said Melissa wanted to meet me. She wanted to know her mother's husband, to understand the family Linda had built after giving her up. The request made everything worse because now I had to decide if I was ready to meet this woman, to look at her face and see my wife's features on someone I'd never known existed. I told Linda I needed time to think about it, and she nodded and went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen, feeling like my life was spinning out of control. I decided to tell Tom first because he'd always been the more emotionally mature one, even as a kid. He came home from college for the weekend, and I asked him to sit down in the living room. I told him his mother had something she needed to explain, but I wanted to tell him first so he'd understand. Then I explained everything, watching his face change as the words sank in. He went through shock first, his eyes getting wide when I said his mother had another daughter. Then confusion, asking questions about how this was possible and why Mom never told us. Finally, something that looked like sympathy settled on his face. He asked if Mom was okay, and that question made me realize he was worried about her, not angry. He wanted to know if she was handling this, if she needed support. I'd expected him to be mad at Linda for lying, but instead he seemed concerned about how hard this must have been for her. His reaction made me feel like maybe I was the one being unreasonable. Jake's reaction was completely different. He came home the next day, and when I told him, he exploded. He asked why Mom had lied his entire life, whether anything else about our family was fake, if we even knew who she really was. His anger gave me permission to feel mine again, to stop trying to be understanding and just be hurt. Linda came downstairs while Jake was yelling and she tried to explain, but he didn't want to hear it. He said she'd had 22 years to tell the truth and chose not to, that she'd picked her secret daughter over being honest with her real family. Linda started crying at the kitchen table, and Tom tried to calm Jake down, but Jake just kept going. He said he didn't know if he could trust her anymore, if anything she'd ever told him was real. Then he left, slamming the door behind him. Linda sat there crying while Tom rubbed her back, and I stood in the doorway watching both our sons process this bomb she'd dropped into our lives, not knowing what to do or say to make any of it better. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions at work while my mind kept replaying Jake's words about not knowing if he could trust Linda anymore. Tom called me twice to check in, asking if I was okay, if Mom was okay, if we were all going to be okay. I didn't have answers for him. Linda moved through the house like she was walking on glass, careful not to make too much noise, not to take up too much space. She cooked dinner every night, even though none of us had much appetite. She did laundry, paid bills, kept the house running like nothing had changed, but her eyes were red every morning and I knew she wasn't sleeping. My phone rang on Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in my car during lunch break. Cecilia's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer because I wasn't ready to talk to anyone, but something made me pick up. She asked if I wanted to meet for coffee, just the two of us, and her voice had this gentle quality that made it hard to say no. We met at a small place near her house, one of those quiet cafes with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Cecilia was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of her. She'd ordered for both of us, remembered that I took my coffee black. We sat in silence for a moment before she started talking about her sister, a woman named Ruth who'd given up a baby when she was 16. Cecilia described how Ruth had spent decades carrying that loss, how it shaped every relationship she had afterward, how she'd wake up on her daughter's birthday every year and spend the entire day unable to function. She told me about the shame Ruth felt, the way their parents had treated her like she'd committed some unforgivable sin, how Ruth had been sent away to have the baby in secret so the neighbors wouldn't find out. Cecilia said that kind of loss doesn't just heal because time passes, that it becomes part of who you are, woven into every decision you make. She wasn't trying to excuse what Linda had done, she said, but she wanted me to understand what my wife had been living with all these years. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours, and by the end of it I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding. That night I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs and opened my laptop. I started searching for information about adoption, birth mothers, the experiences of women who'd given up children. I found forums where women shared their stories, articles about the long-term effects of relinquishing a child, research about the grief that never really ends. The stories were full of women who thought about their children every single day, who wondered if they'd made the right choice, who carried guilt and shame for decades. Some had been able to reconnect with their children later, and they described those relationships as both healing and complicated, full of joy mixed with sorrow for all the years they'd lost. I read about women who'd kept their adoptions secret from their families, from their husbands, because they were afraid of being judged or rejected. I read about the pressure these women had faced from parents, from society, from everyone around them telling them they had no choice. One woman wrote about holding her baby for a few hours before the adoptive parents arrived, how she'd memorized every detail of that infant's face because she thought she'd never see her again. The post could have been written by Linda. I sat there in the dark living room, the laptop screen casting blue light across my face, and I started to see my wife differently. Not as someone who'd lied to me, but as someone who'd survived something I couldn't fully understand. I thought about 19-year-old Linda, alone and scared, being told by her own parents that she'd brought shame on the family. I thought about her giving birth and holding that baby, knowing she had to let go. I thought about the years she'd spent wondering if her daughter was okay, if she was loved, if she was happy. The next morning, Linda and I had our first real conversation since everything had exploded. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, neither of us was drinking, and I asked her to tell me about it, all of it, from the beginning. She took a shaky breath and started talking about being 19 and finding out she was pregnant. Her boyfriend had left the moment she told him, just disappeared without even saying goodbye. Her parents had been furious, told her she'd ruined her life and embarrassed the family. They'd sent her to live with an aunt in another state for the last few months of the pregnancy so nobody in their town would know. Linda described the labor, how scared she'd been, how alone she'd felt even with nurses around her. Then they'd brought her the baby, a little girl with dark hair and tiny fingers that wrapped around Linda's thumb. She'd held her daughter for 2 hours while the adoptive parents waited in another room. Linda said she'd memorized everything about that baby's face, the shape of her nose, the way her mouth moved, the small birthmark on her left shoulder. She'd counted her fingers and toes, kissed her forehead, whispered that she loved her and that she was sorry. Then the social worker had come to take the baby away, and Linda had to hand her over, had to watch them carry her daughter out of the room. She said she'd screamed after they left, cried so hard she couldn't breathe and the nurses had to sedate her. Her parents had picked her up the next day and driven her home like nothing had happened. Nobody ever talked about it again. Linda wiped tears from her face and told me that for years afterward, she'd think about that baby every single day. She'd see little girls in the grocery store and wonder if one of them was her daughter. She'd calculate how old her daughter would be, imagine what she might look like, what kind of person she might become. Linda explained that when Melissa reached out at 18, it had been both the best and worst moment of her life. She'd been thrilled to hear from her daughter, to know that Melissa wanted to meet her, but she'd also been terrified about telling me. We already had Tom and Jake by then. We had our life together, and Linda was afraid I'd see her as damaged or dishonest if I knew about her past. She said she'd planned to tell me so many times, had rehearsed the conversation in her head, but she could never find the right moment. How do you bring up something like that over dinner? How do you casually mention that you have another child when your husband thinks he knows everything about you? The longer she waited, the harder it became, until the secret felt too big to ever confess. She said she'd been living in constant fear for 22 years, afraid that I'd find out somehow, that I'd leave her when I learned the truth. Every time she came home from visiting Melissa, she'd worry that this would be the day I'd figure it out. Linda looked at me across the table and said she understood if I couldn't forgive her, if this was too much, if I needed to leave. She said she'd spent our entire marriage knowing she didn't deserve me, knowing that she was lying by not telling me about Melissa, but she'd been too scared to risk losing what we had. I sat there listening to her, and something clicked into place in my mind. Linda had been carrying this alone for our entire marriage. Every happy moment we'd shared, every milestone with our sons, every quiet evening on the couch, all of it had been shadowed by her fear of losing me if I knew the truth. She'd watched Tom and Jake grow up while thinking about the daughter she'd given away. She'd celebrated birthdays and holidays while carrying grief for the child she couldn't acknowledge. The weight of that kind of secret, the constant fear of discovery, the shame she'd internalized from her parents, all of it had been with her every single day for decades. I understood now why she couldn't just casually mention it over dinner one night. This wasn't like forgetting to tell me about a college boyfriend or a job she'd had before we met. This was a fundamental part of who she was, wrapped up in trauma and shame and fear. The secret had become so big, so heavy, that there was no easy way to confess it. I looked at my wife, really looked at her, and saw the toll this had taken. The lines around her eyes, the way she carried herself like she was always bracing for something bad to happen, the careful way she moved through our life together. She'd been living in fear for 24 years and I'd never noticed. Morris called me that weekend and suggested couples counseling. I told him I didn't think it would help, that this wasn't something a therapist could fix, but he pushed back. He said Linda and I needed a neutral space to work through this, someone who could help us communicate without it turning into a fight. I was resistant to the idea because it felt like admitting our marriage was broken, but when I mentioned it to Linda, she agreed immediately. She said she'd go to counseling, she'd do whatever I needed, she'd answer any question I had. Her willingness, the almost desperate way she agreed, made me realize she was fighting for us in a way I hadn't fully recognized. We found someone named Joyce Wheeler who had good reviews and could see us quickly. The first session was awkward, both of us sitting on opposite ends of a couch in Joyce's small office, not sure where to start. Joyce asked us to explain what had brought us in, and Linda told the whole story while I sat there listening to her describe our marriage from her perspective. Joyce didn't judge or take sides. She just listened and asked questions that made us both think about things differently. By the end of that first hour, I felt like maybe we could actually talk about this without it exploding into anger and tears. Having a neutral space to voice everything, to say the things we'd been holding back, made the conversations less intense. We went back to Joyce the following week, and then again the week after that. In our third session, Joyce asked me what I was afraid of if I met Melissa. I'd been avoiding thinking about that question, but sitting there in her office with Linda next to me, I finally admitted it. I was scared of seeing how much Linda loved her. I was afraid that when I met Melissa, I'd see something in Linda's face that I'd never seen before. Some kind of love or connection that she'd never had with our sons. Joyce leaned forward and said something that stuck with me. She said love isn't finite, that Linda loving Melissa doesn't mean she loves me or Tom or Jake any less. Love doesn't work like a pie where each person gets a smaller slice when someone new is added. Linda can love all of us completely without any of that love being diminished. The idea seemed obvious once Joyce said it out loud, but I'd been operating under the assumption that Linda's love for Melissa somehow took something away from us. I'd been jealous of a woman I'd never met because I thought she was taking something that belonged to me and our sons. After that session, I told Linda I'd meet Melissa, but I needed it to be just the three of us first. No Lily, no Arnold, no extended family. I couldn't handle performing for an audience, pretending everything was fine when I was still processing all of this. Linda looked both relieved and scared when I said it, and I realized this meeting was just as hard for her as it was for me. She'd kept these two parts of her life separate for so long that bringing them together felt dangerous. What if Melissa and I didn't get along? What if seeing us together made Linda's fear of losing one of us feel more real? I could see all of that playing out on her face, but she nodded and said she'd arrange it. She'd talk to Melissa and we'd find a time that worked for everyone. Tom came home the following weekend and asked if we could talk. He said he'd been thinking about everything, about Mom's secret and Melissa and all of it. Then he told me he wanted to meet his half-sister eventually. Jake had said the same thing in a text message the day before, though his message had been shorter and less emotional. Tom seemed genuinely curious about this whole other person who shared his DNA, asking questions about what Melissa was like, what she did for work, whether she looked like Mom. His acceptance of the situation made me feel like I was the one being stubborn, the only person in our family who couldn't move forward. Our sons had processed this bomb and decided they wanted to know their half-sister, while I was still struggling with the basic idea of meeting her. Their willingness to embrace this new reality made me feel both proud of them and ashamed of myself for taking so long to get to this point. The meeting happened 2 weeks later at a quiet restaurant halfway between our homes. Linda had picked the place carefully, somewhere neutral where none of us would feel like we had home advantage. I was nervous the entire drive there, my hands tight on the steering wheel while Linda sat in the passenger seat giving me worried glances. We arrived first and got a table in the back corner, away from other diners. Then Melissa walked in, and I felt my breath catch because she looked so much like Linda. Same dark hair, same eyes, same way of holding her shoulders slightly hunched like she was protecting herself from something. She was nervous. I could tell by the way she kept fidgeting with her purse strap as she walked toward our table. Linda stood up and hugged her, and I watched them embrace, saw the easy affection between them that came from 22 years of monthly visits. Then Melissa turned to me and held out her hand. She thanked me for being willing to meet her, said she knew this must be hard, that she appreciated me giving her a chance. Her words made me feel guilty because she was thanking me for something I should have done weeks ago, for being willing to meet someone who was part of my wife's life, and therefore part of mine. We sat down at the table and I ordered coffee just to have something to do with my hands. Melissa ordered tea and Linda got water, and we all stared at the menus like they contained answers to questions none of us knew how to ask. The server came by and took our orders and left, and then it was just the three of us sitting in this uncomfortable silence that felt heavy. Melissa spoke first, asking me about my work and where I grew up. Basic getting-to-know-you questions that felt strange given the situation. I answered because what else was I supposed to do, telling her about the engineering firm where I'd worked for 20 years and about growing up in Ohio. She told me she worked as a teacher, 3rd grade, and that she loved kids even though they drove her crazy sometimes. She talked about her adoptive parents, how they raised her in a small town and gave her piano lessons and took her camping every summer. She said they were good people who loved her completely and never made her feel like she was anything other than their daughter. But she also said there was always this empty space inside her, this wondering about where she came from and who her birth mother was. When Linda reached out after Melissa turned 18, it filled something that had been missing her whole life. Melissa looked at Linda when she said this, and I saw the way my wife's eyes got wet. Melissa said she understood why Linda gave her up, that she didn't blame her for making an impossible choice when she was just a kid herself. She said meeting Linda had given her answers to questions she'd carried around since she was old enough to understand adoption. The way she talked about it made me realize this wasn't just some side relationship for Linda, it was healing something broken inside both of them. I sat there listening to Melissa describe what it meant to finally know her birth mother, and I started to understand why Linda couldn't walk away from this. It wasn't about choosing Melissa over me or our sons, it was about fixing something that got shattered when she was 19 years old. We ate lunch and talked about safer things, like Lily's kindergarten class and Arnold's job in IT and the house they bought last year. Melissa showed me pictures on her phone of Lily at her dance recital, and I could see Linda in the little girl's face. After we paid the bill and walked out to the parking lot, Melissa hugged Linda and then turned to me. She thanked me again for meeting her and said she hoped we could do this again sometime, that she wanted to know the man her mother married. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice, and then Linda and I got in the car. We drove in silence for the first 20 minutes, neither of us knowing what to say. Linda kept glancing at me like she was trying to read my face, trying to figure out if this meeting had made things better or worse. Finally, I said that Melissa seemed like a good person, that I could see why Linda wanted to be part of her life. Linda's hands started shaking on the steering wheel, and tears ran down her face. She pulled over into a gas station parking lot and just sat there crying, these big gulping sobs that shook her whole body. I reached over and put my hand on her shoulder, and she grabbed it with both of hers, holding on like I might disappear if she let go. She said she was sorry over and over, that she never meant to hurt me, that she loved me and our boys more than anything. I believed her because I could hear it in her voice, could feel it in the way she held my hand. We sat there in that parking lot for 15 minutes while she cried, and I tried to figure out what I was feeling. It wasn't anger anymore, or at least not the same kind of anger I'd felt when I first found out. It was something more complicated, this mix of hurt and understanding that didn't cancel each other out, but existed together. When Linda calmed down enough to drive, we went home and I told her we needed to go back to Joyce's office, that we needed help figuring out how to move forward from here. Joyce met with us 3 days later and asked us both what we wanted our marriage to look like going forward. Linda said she wanted to stop hiding, that she wanted to share her relationship with Melissa, instead of keeping it secret. She said she'd tell me before every visit, show me pictures if I wanted to see them, include me in that part of her life if I was willing. I said I needed regular check-ins about how we were both feeling, that I couldn't handle another 22 years of secrets, even small ones. Joyce helped us create an actual plan, writing down things like honesty and communication, and acknowledging that rebuilding trust takes time. Linda agreed to be completely open about her visits with Melissa, and I agreed to stop punishing her for being afraid all those years ago. Joyce said we were both going to have bad days, days where the hurt felt fresh again, or where Linda's guilt overwhelmed her. She said that was normal and didn't mean we were failing, it just meant we were doing hard work. We left that session with a piece of paper that had our plan written on it, and Linda folded it carefully and put it in her purse like it was something precious. 3 months passed and things got slowly better between us. Linda started telling me about her visits with Melissa, showing me pictures of Lily and talking about what they did together. It still hurt sometimes, but less than before, and I found myself actually curious about this daughter my wife had been visiting for 2 decades. Tom and Jake both met Melissa separately, and they came home talking about their half-sister like she'd always been part of our family. Jake said she was cool, and that Lily was cute, and Tom spent an hour telling me about their conversation about teaching and education. Watching my sons accept Melissa so easily made me feel like I needed to do better, like I was the only one still holding on to hurt that everyone else had moved past. Linda suggested we host a family dinner with everyone, all of us together in one place for the first time. The idea scared me, but I said yes because I knew we couldn't move forward if I kept everyone in separate boxes. We set the date for a Saturday in October, and Linda spent the whole week before cooking and cleaning and being nervous. Tom and Jake showed up first, then Melissa arrived with Arnold and Lily. The little girl hid behind her mother's legs at first, shy around all these new people. We sat down at the dining room table and it was awkward, everyone trying too hard to make conversation and be normal. But then Lily started talking about her stuffed animals, and Jake made her laugh and things got easier. I watched Linda with her granddaughter, saw the way her whole face lit up when Lily climbed into her lap. That joy was real and pure, and I realized I wanted Linda to have it. I wanted her to be happy even when that happiness were included parts of her life that didn't include me. Arnold turned out to be a decent guy who clearly loved his wife and daughter, and Melissa fit into our family better than I expected. We weren't fixed and probably wouldn't be for a long time, but we were all sitting at the same table trying.